when a young man was shot dead in a Mews house in Knightsbridge in 1932, the only other person present was his lover, Elvira Barney. The gun he was shot with was hers. There was evidence she had shot at him previously, and she had been heard by 3 people saying she was going to shoot him immediately before the shot was fired. It should have been the simplest of cases for the prosecution, but it wasn't. Justice is often portrayed as a blindfolded woman carrying measuring scales. This is because justice is about the weighing of evidence, and in this it must be blind. The lord who kills his servant must be treated the same as the servant who kills his lord. Justice does not care who you are. There is a presumption in this, that a consent exists between us all, to surrender certain personal rights in favour of a community arbitration. That's essential for justice to function properly. But in the case of Elvira Barney in 1932, it may surely be said that justice was merely pretending to be blind.
It was approximately 4:40 a.m. on the 31st of May 1932 when Dr. Thomas Durrant was woken at his home in Westbourne Terrace in West London by the telephone ringing. On answering it, the frantic voice of a woman, which he recognized to be that of a patient of his called Elvira Barney, told him, "Doctor, come at once. There has been a terrible accident." "What is the matter?" he inquired. "A man has shot himself," she told him. He dressed, collected his medical bag, and called for a taxicab, arriving at 21 William Mews in Knightsbridge, where she lived, at 6 a.m. On being admitted to the house by Elvira Barney, Dr. Durrant found a young man lying sprawled on the landing at the top of the stairs, and a revolver lay close by. It was immediately clear that he was dead, and Durrant quickly ascertained that he had been shot in the chest. The woman, Elvira Barney, was in a hysterical state. She told him that she and the young man, a friend called Michael Stephen, had quarrelled, that she had threatened to kill herself with the revolver, and he had tried to wrest it from her, during which it had gone off. The police were called, and Detective Inspector William Winter arrived at the scene some time before 7 a.m. He examined the revolver and surveyed the scene, and said to Elvira Barney, "I want some explanation of this. He has undoubtedly been shot." Elvira Barney became angry, and she told him to get out. Miss Barney was clearly the worse for wear, had been drinking, which together with recent events may have been responsible for her state of high excitement. Inspector Winter did his best to calm her down. "We had a quarrel, and he got the revolver from a chair," she told him. "We struggled, and it went off. It is terrible." Winter said that he would need her to accompany him to Gerrard Road Police Station to make a statement. A colleague, Detective Sergeant Campion, helpfully suggested she could put her fur coat on to keep her warm on the journey to Gerrard Road, at which she flew into a rage and struck him in the face. It was a bit of an impasse for the 2 rather overly respectful officers, but at this moment the phone rang. Inspector Winter answered it. It was Lady Evelyn Mullins, Elvira Barney's mother. He dutifully handed over the phone to Elvira. When she had replaced the receiver, she turned to Inspector Winter and said, "Now you know who my mother is, you will be a little more careful in how you speak to me. I'll teach you to say you will take me to a police station." The young woman's parents, Sir John and Lady Evelyn Mullins, arrived at the house a short time afterwards. They accompanied her to Gerrard Road Police Station, where she made a statement, taking her afterwards to their home at nearby 6 Belgrave Square. Neighbours gave police slightly varying accounts of the events of that night, but it was clear that there had been a party at 21 William Mews, with approximately 30 guests arriving there at around 7 p.m. and leaving at about 9 p.m. Soon afterwards, the young man, Michael Stephen, and Elvira Barney had left in her saloon motor car together. Neighbours had been awoken at around 4 a.m. There was a violent quarrel in progress between a man and a woman at number 21. Mrs. Barney was heard to scream, "Get out of my house at once! I hate you! Get out! I will shoot you!" The man was heard to say, "I am going." A shot followed soon after this, and the man cried, "Good God, what have you done?" The woman could be heard screaming, "Michael, come back to me." This was followed by silence for 15 minutes. Then Mrs. Barney was heard to call the name Michael twice, and then there was a terrible silence. It seems that rows between the couple were common, and that 11 days previously, neighbours in the Mews had seen Michael Stephen leave number 21 following such a row, and, as he walked away from the house, Elvira Barney appeared at an upper window with a revolver in her hand and fired a shot at him. She had missed, and the couple had reconciled the following morning, Michael Stephen having slept in an empty grocer's van in the Mews during the night. Police noted that the revolver had 2 empty cartridges in its 5 chambers, and examination of the house revealed a bullet hole in a wall. When questioned, one neighbour thought there had been 2 shots fired, and another thought it was possibly 4 or even 5, but it may have been that doors slamming in the house during the row had confused them. For her part, Elvira Barney confirmed that there had been a party for 30 friends at number 21 William Mews, which was equipped with a cocktail bar in its sitting room, and that she and Michael Stephen had left the house at 10 p.m. in her car. They had arrived at the Café de Paris at about midnight for a late supper, where they were joined by a friend, Arthur Tilden Jeffress. The 3 of them went together to the Blue Angel Club in Dean Street, and she and Michael Scott returned to their Mews residence at about 2 a.m. They had quarrelled, and she had told him to leave. She had said she would kill herself, and he had taken the revolver from beneath a cushion on the chair. They had struggled over this, and it had gone off. She did not realize he was injured until he called from another room, telling her to fetch a doctor. Michael Stephen had, she said, expressed his impatience for the doctor to arrive, so he could tell him that this was not Elvira's fault. But the pathologist, Sir Bernard Spilsbury, examined the body of Michael Scott Stephen in the house on the 31st of May before its removal, and later carried out a post-mortem. And as a result of this, he reported that he considered it unlikely that Michael Stephen had shot himself. Robert Churchill, the expert London gunsmith, concurred. He thought that the gun had been pointed directly at the victim, and that Michael Stephen could not have fired it himself. Having considered all the evidence, the police now concluded that Elvira Barney's story was, at best unlikely, at worst impossible. At 6:40 on the evening of the 3rd of June 1932, Inspector Winter, together with Detective Sergeant Campion, went to 6 Belgrave Square. Here they saw Elvira Barney. Winter said, "You know that I am Detective Inspector Winter, and this other officer is Detective Sergeant Campion. Do you feel capable of understanding anything I may say to you?" She nodded. "I am going to charge you with the murder of Thomas William Scott Stephen on May the 31st at 21 William Mews." At the police station she was formally charged, and said, "I did not shoot him. I am not guilty." Elvira Barney was born Elvira Enid Mullins on the 22nd of January 1904, the daughter of Sir John Ashley Mullins and his wife Evelyn Maud. Mullins was a wealthy financier and stockbroker, whose firm Mullins & Co. were advisers to the Government National Debt Commissioners. The family lived at the prestigious address of 6 Belgrave Square in Knightsbridge. They had more than 20 servants, and counted amongst their neighbours King George V's youngest son, Prince George. Elvira's sister, Avril, had, at the age of just 16, married a Prince Emeritinsky, which had caused a great stir. These were headstrong girls, Elvira liked to be the centre of attention, and possessing no particular academic application, she decided to become an actress. She took training at Lady Constance Benson's acting school in London. If she had any talents as an actress, these were of a light, comedic and musical kind. She had a forgettable part in a forgettable play called The Blue Kitten at the Gaiety Theatre in 1925, but it was quickly apparent that her greatest role was to be that of Elvira Barney. The 1920s was a decade of change. There was a rejection of the values of pre-war society, and the role of women in society was changing too. The grimness of war and the terrible toll it had taken on a generation of youth fostered a hedonistic outlook which was characterized by drinking, drug-taking and sexual promiscuity, at least amongst the stratum of society which could afford to indulge it. The term bright young things was coined by the press as a phrase to describe a certain type of wealthy young aristocratic person whose lack of apparent ambition, traditional morals, or any great talent was codified and to an extent mitigated by this appellation. Elvira Barney was certainly a bright young thing. She had money, or parents who were unstinting in providing her with it, possessed no moral restraint that could be discerned, and had no purpose in life other than to attend parties with like-minded individuals, drinking, experimenting with a variety of drugs, and indulging in promiscuous sexual behaviour. Though many of her set consisted of a lesbian, homosexual 1920s subculture, she seemed on the whole to prefer men, but she had sexual affairs with women also. For Elvira and her friends, their way of life is immortalized in the words of the Cole Porter song, "Anything Goes." In 1927 she met John Sterling Barney of a vocal group called the Three New Yorkers, who performed at various West End parties and at the Café de Paris, the epicentre of the louche world of the bright young things. Barney was American, and Elvira and he were married on the 2nd of August 1928, after a brief acquaintance. The marriage didn't last long. Within months it was over, and by 1929 Barney had returned to New York. They were still married, though. Elvira, now 25, already known for a lack of restraint in all her conduct, began drinking more and using cocaine heavily. She had a string of lovers, all of whom seemed to be casual, often interchangeable, many indulging in fetishistic sexual activities of one sort or another. The police report into the crime reported that officers found items and literature at the scene which they regarded as being more suitable to a brothel than to a domestic home. In 1931, Elvira met Michael Scott Stephen, who was 23 years old, had been educated at Shrewsbury School, was known as an excellent cricketer there, and whose appetite for partying matched hers. It has been claimed that he was bisexual, and whilst there is no proof of this, it is a reasonable assumption that he was, given the circles he moved in and the friendships he cultivated. His family, who were Scottish but lived in Kent, were respectable. His father was a banker, and his brother a solicitor. Michael was employed briefly at the Edinburgh branch of the Northern Assurance Company, but he was restless, adventurous. He had travelled to Paris with the ambition, it seems, of becoming a dress designer, and it was here he met Elvira, some time after her separation from John Barney, and probably in the autumn of 1931. By December 1931 he had moved into William Mews with Elvira. They had a volatile relationship from the start. They quarrelled regularly. They partied until the early hours became old, and spent their days in bed until noon. Their indolent and purposeless lives were livened periodically by blazing rows, often physical in nature. Michael Stephen appeared to have no source of income except that which Elvira gave him. His family had cut off his financial support 2 or 3 years earlier in an attempt to rein him in, though he occasionally received help from his mother. He was also a prodigious sponger. He borrowed from everyone. As far as their neighbours in William Mews were concerned, the couple were a nuisance. Most of the residents of the Mews were coachmen and chauffeurs for the big houses on Lowndes Square, the Mews housing having originally been conceived as stables for the wealthy square inhabitants' coaches. Elvira Barney, whose Mews house was a modern crash pad whimsically converted from a stable coach house, was regarded as a nuisance. She and her live-in lover, Michael Stephen, held noisy parties, arrived home at all hours, and had rows which disturbed the lives of the working residents of the Mews. The shooting of Michael Stephen appeared to them to be the culmination of many months of disturbances. Proceedings opened against Elvira Barney on the 11th of June 1932 at Westminster Police Court. The charges against her were of the wilful murder of Michael Stephen on the 31st of May and intent to cause grievous bodily harm to him on the 19th of May. The Crown Solicitor outlined the case which it proposed should go before the Central Criminal Court for trial. The gist of this was that the two had quarrelled and Mrs. Barney had shot Michael Stephen. There were several important witnesses whose evidence was heard here. Mrs. Dorothy Hall, who lived opposite, had been witness to many incidents. The Mews being narrow and Mrs. Hall being blessed with good hearing, she appeared to have heard a great deal. She said that after the cocktail party between 7 and 9 on the 30th of May, Elvira Barney and Michael Stephen left the Mews in Mrs. Barney's car at around 10 p.m. She was awoken at about 4:30 a.m. by screaming and shouting, and she looked out of the window. At number 21, she heard Barney telling Michael Stephen to get out, and then twice heard her say she would shoot him. She said she heard him say he would go. Then a shot rang out, and Michael shouted, "Good God, what have you done?" Then Mrs. Barney was heard screaming, "Come back to me." This was followed by silence, before Mrs. Barney called his name, Michael, twice more. She also told of the terrible row at 3:30 a.m. on the 19th of May, when there had been an altercation with a taxi driver. Michael Stephen was asking Elvira for money, and she refused. At length she had appeared at the window and called out, "Laugh, baby, laugh for the last time." And then she had fired a gun at him. Mrs. Kate Stevens, another Mews resident, told the court she was awoken by a dog barking and heard pistol shots. She got out of bed and heard 2 more shots, 4 in total. Then she heard Mrs. Barney imploring, "Come back, Michael. I love you. I'll do anything you say." William Kiff, who lived next door to Elvira, gave evidence that he heard a quarrel between the two at around 4:40 a.m., and Mrs. Barney called out, "I will shoot you," making a clear threat, which was followed by the sound of a shot. Dr. Durrant told the court of his phone call in which Elvira had been frantic and told him that a man had shot himself. At 14 minutes past 5 his taxi had arrived and he went to William Mews. Elvira Barney answered the door and ushered him upstairs, following behind him. On the landing, with his legs trailing on the upper stairs, lay Michael Stephen. A revolver lay about 4 inches from his left hand. Elvira Barney kept saying, "He is not dead, is he? Do something for him." He had said, "We must send for the police." She replied, "Oh, don't do that. You must not do that." "Do be quiet. You must be quiet," he said to her. He said that she had told him that Michael Stephen had said he was going to leave her for another woman, and that she had threatened to kill herself, and Michael Stephen had picked up a revolver from beneath a cushion on a chair, saying, "Well, you won't do it with this." They fought over it, and the gun went off. Inspector Winter gave evidence concerning his arrival at the scene, the altercation during which he had struck Detective Sergeant Campion, and his examination of the revolver, from which 2 bullets had been discharged. He said he had noticed a bullet hole in a corner wardrobe and a mark in the wall from which the bullet had clearly ricocheted. On inquiry, she told him it was from a previous occasion on which she had fired the revolver at random. Sir Bernard Spilsbury gave evidence of the scene of the crime, which he had visited on the day of the murder, and of the post-mortem he had carried out on the body of Michael Stephen later. Death had been caused by hemorrhage due to bleeding from the lung. The bullet had entered the chest horizontally and narrowly missed the top of the heart. He said death would have occurred no more than 10 minutes after the shot had been fired. He also said that it was not impossible, but extremely unlikely, for the shooting to have been accidental. The absence of singe marks to the sleeves or hands of the deceased suggested that his hands had not been anywhere near the revolver when it was fired. Robert Churchill, the foremost gunsmith in London at the time, gave evidence of the 14-pound pull required to activate the trigger of the .32 Smith & Wesson revolver, rendering it highly unlikely that it could have been pulled accidentally. He also noted the absence of blackening on the victim's hands, which, he concluded, made it improbable he had been in contact with the revolver at the time of its discharge. As a result of this evidence, on the 18th of June 1932, Elvira Barney was committed for trial. The trial of Elvira Barney opened at the Old Bailey on the 4th of July 1932 before Justice Travers Humphreys. Sir Percival Clarke appeared for the Crown, and the former Attorney General Sir Patrick Hastings appeared for the defence. It was an extraordinary affair. For the first time in the new Old Bailey's history, the courtroom seats were available by allocation only. A mere 36 seats in the public gallery were available to the public, and people who queued often did so in the hope of being able to sell their seat on for an exalted price. Bewigged barristers sat on the floor while celebrities, actors, and the noblesse of London society filled the seats of No. 1 Court. The Daily Mirror likened it to a theatrical first night rather than to a trial. The fashionable and titled were out in force to see the trial of one of their own. Astonishingly, one of the chief prosecution witnesses, with 30 years' experience of murder trials behind him, Sir Bernard Spilsbury no less, was unable to find a seat. At length a police inspector invited him to share his seat, the two alternating. Meanwhile, actors like George Arliss and his party sat back to enjoy the show. The ushers were scarcely heeded when they called for silence, but the audience settled quickly when Judge Travers Humphreys, in full pomp and circumstance, appeared carrying a bouquet of flowers, a holdover from the days when it was believed that the scent of flowers could ward off plague. He took his seat, and the clerk cried, "Bring up Elvira Barney." Wearing black, with a white blouse, demure, puritanical almost, Elvira Barney, accompanied by 3 warders, made her entrance. Amongst the bewigged clerks and lawyers, dressed in the Quaker style of the English courtroom, she seemed perfectly cast for her role. She was holding a pair of white gloves, and stared from the dock as the jurors' names were read out. Sir Percival Clarke opened for the prosecution with a description of the events of the evening of the 30th of May, leading up to the death of Michael Stephen in the early hours of the 31st. The witnesses gave evidence very much as they had done at the magistrates' hearing in Westminster Police Court the previous month. The prosecution case was based on 4 compelling pieces of evidence. First, at least one shot had been heard that night, which was evidenced by the testimony of witnesses in the Mews and by the fact that Michael Stephen had been shot. Second, 3 witnesses who heard the shot also heard Mrs. Barney speak the words, "I will shoot you," immediately prior to the sound of the shot. All 3 witnesses, separately and independently, informed police of a clear intention being expressed by Elvira Barney prior to the shot being heard. Third, several inhabitants of the Mews spoke of a violent quarrel 11 days prior to the murder, in which they saw Michael Stephen leave the house and walk away, and Mrs. Barney open the window and scream, "Laugh, baby, laugh for the last time," before firing the revolver at him. Fourth, the expert witnesses, Sir Bernard Spilsbury and Robert Churchill, thought it highly improbable that the victim could have pulled the trigger himself, and that the angle of the bullet wound, its disposition, and the resultant wound, as well as the lack of any singe marks or powder residue on the victim's hands or sleeves, strongly suggested that the gun was pointed directly at him, and had been fired by a hand other than his own. The defence, in the hands of the consummate barrister and former Attorney General Sir Patrick Hastings, countered this by arguing that, first, there was only one shot fired. The witness testifying initially to 2 or 4 shots being fired was mistaken, and furthermore, the bullet mark in the wall was the result of a shot being fired on a previous occasion, fired at no particular person. Second, the witnesses who heard Mrs. Barney shout, "I will shoot you," or similar words to that effect, actually only heard the words, "I will shoot," because she was, in fact, threatening suicide, not to shoot Michael Stephen, whom she loved. Third, the couple frequently quarrelled, and Elvira Barney freely admitted this. The occasion when she was alleged to have fired through a window was not reported to police, and should be disregarded. No bullet had been found in the mews, and the matter was trifling and unsupportable. Fourth, Sir Bernard Spilsbury and Robert Churchill were wrong in their evidence that the gun could not have been fired by Michael Stephen, and there was, in fact, nothing in Elvira Barney's account of events which was inconsistent with any of the evidence. Her account had been given first to the doctor, then to the police, and now to the court, unvarying in its detail. Furthermore, Dr. Durrant had given it as his opinion that on the fatal morning the defendant's condition was hysterical, and she could not have invented the story she told him. Sir Patrick Hastings did sterling work in undermining the testimony of the main witnesses who had testified to the critical points concerning the quarrel, these being the expression of Elvira Barney's intention to shoot Michael Stephen, followed by the sound of the shot itself. Dorothy Hall was coaxed into the admission that Michael Stephen was afraid of leaving Elvira Barney alone for fear she'd commit suicide. Her claim that Elvira Barney had said, "Chicken, chicken, come back to me," was ridiculed by Hastings, and as the witness, Kate Stevens, had heard the words, "Michael, Michael, come back to me," and Elvira Barney herself claimed she had said, "Mickey, Mickey, come back to me," it was clear that Mrs. Hall had comically misheard. Of course, this was of no substance, but it tended to undermine the credibility of the witness. "How awful it would be," said Sir Patrick, "if the life of any one of us might depend upon the evidence of women like these," gesturing towards the 2 women. He then called Elvira Barney to give evidence on her own behalf. She proved a good witness, tearful at the right times, fainting, perhaps judiciously, at dramatic moments, and even requiring the administration of smelling salts at times. She spoke of her brief marriage to John Barney, and her subsequent meeting with Michael Stephen. She wanted to marry him, but divorce from Barney was not a simple matter, as her husband was American. She said she was sometimes frightened of Mickey, and one letter he had written her was cited in court, referring to "dreadful, horrible things I have done" in support of this. On one occasion she was so frightened of him she called the police, she said. She also said Michael gambled, and he did so with a woman. Sir Patrick wound up his questioning by asking, "Have you ever in your life desired to shoot Michael Stephen?" "Never," she replied. "Has there ever been in your life anybody you were ever fonder of than Michael Stephen?" "No, never." "Did you shoot him that night?" "No." "Had you a motive for shooting him?" "None." Sir Percival Clarke's cross-examination for the prosecution now followed, a moment of appreciable anxiety for the defence, because it is here that the public prosecutor is expected to break the defendant's composure and expose the inconsistencies and weaknesses of their story. But his cross-examination was surprisingly moderate. A casual observer might at times have wondered whether Percy Clarke was the prosecuting or the defence counsel. "Did you think he was going to leave you for another woman?" asked Sir Percy. "No, I did not think that." "You were very much in love with him?" "Yes." Was the cause of your quarrel always money? Yes, money and his gambling habits, in which the woman encouraged him. This somewhat surprising line of questioning, which at first glance appears to be pursuing a motive for her to have murdered Michael Stephen, actually elicits important points for the defence. It allowed Elvira to establish that the relationship with the woman was not a sexual one, but monetary in nature, and therefore had the effect of diminishing the suspicion of jealousy on her part as being her motive, and it reinforced her claim that she loved him, and that her concerns for him were selfless, altruistic even, because the other woman was a bad influence on him. Sir Percival Clarke nevertheless gave his summary of the prosecution case by stating that the cause of the trouble between the couple was another woman, and the motive was jealousy. There was no blackening on the victim's hand, and he said that it was Elvira Barney's finger which had been on the trigger when it was fired. Sir Patrick Hastings' final address to the jury was excellent. His opening took a savage swipe at the fashionable and celebrity audience in attendance in court. "We rather despise some of these people," he said. "If they expect to find amusement here, they will not find it in me." Turning to the case, he summarized the inadequacies of the prosecution case, and concluded by declaring that there was not enough evidence to hang a cat, and that Elvira Barney should never have been put on trial. The judge summed up, calling Sir Patrick Hastings' speech one of the finest I have ever heard at the bar. He told the jury that there was little predisposition to sympathize with either the accused or the victim in the case. But Travers Humphreys made clear his belief that the case against Elvira Barney was not proven by the prosecution. He also gave his direct opinion that had he been asked to rule on the evidence concerning the shooting from a window on the 19th of May, he would have ruled this evidence as being insufficient to go before a jury. The jury was sent out to consider 3 possible verdicts: murder, manslaughter, and not guilty. They were absent for nearly 2 hours, which surprised many, and upon their return to the courtroom they gave their verdict as not guilty of murder, and not guilty of manslaughter. Sir Percival Clarke promptly withdrew the charge relating to the discharge of the revolver on the 19th of May. In truth, he could hardly do otherwise, as the judge had already determined the matter. A charge of common assault was then formally put to Elvira Barney, to which she pleaded not guilty, and the judge directed the jury to return a verdict of not guilty in this, which they duly did. Her parents left the court in a large limousine with a young woman as a decoy, which the crowd naturally assumed was Elvira. But in fact, aided by this subterfuge, the acquitted woman left by a side door, unnoticed, and walked to the corner of Giltspur Street, where a taxi awaited her. The verdict was greeted by the press with a howl of disapproval. There could be no one who took any great pride or satisfaction in the conduct of the trial. Time magazine across the Atlantic pilloried the judge's beaming endorsement of Sir Patrick Hastings' great speech for the defence. Whatever the merits of his forensic oratory, in truth it had scarcely been an uphill battle for him, given the absence of an effective prosecution. Travers Humphreys' praise of the speech merely gave the freewheeling defence greater momentum. From the proper but limited perspective of due process, a crime had been apprehended by the police. It had been investigated. The Director of Public Prosecutions had brought charges to bear, and the accused had stood their trial before 12 men and women, and had been exonerated of the crime. Justice had been satisfied, or at least the process had been. But from the less procedurally sound, yet none the less valid perspective of the public, justice had not been done. A woman had shot her lover dead following a row. She had shot at him previously, threatening to kill him. She had been heard to express her intention of shooting the victim before the fatal shot was fired. The relevant medical and firearms experts had declared the victim to have been shot by another person, at between 3 inches and 6 inches range. Yet she had been declared not guilty of any crime. It was treated with some scepticism. Had she been a poorer woman from a different background, who had shot her lover in the same circumstances, would she have been found not guilty? It was a question that many people felt entitled to ask. Elvira Barney's claims that she had not at first realized there was anything wrong with Michael Stephen was belied by 3 facts. First, there was blood spatter on the walls of the room. Second, the sound of the revolver heard around the mews would have been deafening and shocking in the house itself. Third, his collapse would have occurred quickly, as blood filled his lungs. Her claim that he had repeatedly said that he wished to tell the doctor that his wound was not Elvira's fault bears little credibility either. In the circumstance, the severity of his wound, which was extensive, which splintered 2 ribs and had narrowly missed the heart, meant he lost consciousness quickly, and was in fact suffocating on his own blood. Many years after the trial of Elvira Barney, the judge, Travers Humphreys, wrote a book in which he devoted a chapter to the case. His account of the trial is fascinating, as an insight into his thinking. And it is more than this. It is a careful revisiting and reappraisal of the case with the benefit of hindsight, a retrospective justification of his own position, and an explanation by himself, to himself even, of why the prosecution failed. In it he lays out the conditions for the failure of the case, and the positions of the prosecution and defence barristers as well as his own. There was a glaring error in the conduct of the trial, and Humphreys is aware of it. This relates to the question of the failure of the prosecution to press the charge of manslaughter as a possible option to the jury. A prosecution in respect of murder failing, the charge of manslaughter would surely be the natural alternative. The circumstances were reckless in the extreme. The possession of the gun was illegal. The evidence of what was heard by neighbours, of Elvira Barney shooting the revolver out of the window at the victim on a previous occasion, and of her having either then or even on a previous occasion fired the revolver in the house, were surely sufficient at the very least to warrant a verdict of manslaughter. Travers Humphreys was not to blame for this failure, but he was not entirely blameless either. It was a most benign assertion by the judge that had the evidence relating to the incident on the 19th of May and the discharge of the revolver out of the window been put to him, he would have ruled it out. He effectively dismissed a significant piece of narrative evidence from the prosecution case. There was multiple eyewitness evidence in support of this incident. There was evidence that a bullet had been fired in the apartment, and evidence that 3 bullets had been discharged in total in recent weeks. It was a substantial and reasonable part of the prosecution case that the accused was a highly unstable young woman, who illegally possessed a revolver and had, on at least one other occasion, shot at Michael Stephen. This act of persistent aggression was supported by other evidence. Elvira had called the police to remove Michael Stephen from her house on previous occasions. She had done so in respect of a previous lover, and she had assaulted Detective Sergeant Campion on the morning of the murder when he had suggested she put on her fur coat to accompany them to the police station. Michael Stephen had bruises, had received a black eye and swollen lip from Elvira during the altercation on the 19th of May. This evidence was all germane to the case. So would other evidence have been, had it been heard in court. The journalist, Charles Graves, had, according to various accounts, been shot at by Elvira outside his flat when she caught him with a male companion there in 1924. And Humphreys was well aware of this deficiency. There remains the question of manslaughter. He writes, "Nothing had been said by Sir Percival Clarke as to manslaughter in his summing up to the jury of the case, and I am sure there must have been a good reason for it, though I do not understand it. As a matter of law, the more the theory of attempted suicide was stressed, the more clearly would it appear that the deceased man was killed as the direct result of the unlawful act of the accused. Humphreys thus critiques the matter admirably and succinctly. But it was surely incumbent on Humphreys to seek greater clarification for the jury on the manslaughter charge, so that, at the very least, the jury should be aware of what constituted manslaughter. In the event, they were presented with the option of manslaughter as a possible verdict without being given the proper guidance as to its application. That, of course, meant the jury was presented with a somewhat stark decision: to hang a 27-year-old woman who may indeed have been reckless with a firearm and to have unlawfully killed a man, or to find her not guilty. Given the circumstances, it is not surprising they felt obliged to return a verdict of not guilty. Nor is it surprising that the press were not convinced that due process had served justice in this case. Because it hadn't. In his account, Humphreys, referring to the jury being presented with a simple choice, had effectively denied the possibility of bringing in a lesser verdict of manslaughter, also writes, "I have known such a thing happen on at least one other occasion." The case he undoubtedly referred to here was that of Marguerite Alibert, a woman charged in similar circumstances to Elvira Barney 6 years earlier. She too had killed her lover, in this case her young husband, in circumstances in which there could be little doubt as to the fact that she had shot him and that in doing so she acted unlawfully. In her case, too, there were powerful figures who sought by all means available to them to ensure her acquittal. All the elements in Marguerite Alibert's case were there too: a strong police case, evidence of intention, evidence of motive, evidence of means, and an outcome which made prosecution quite inevitable. But Marguerite Alibert had been the lover of the Prince of Wales. She had possession of the Prince of Wales' letters, and probably a great deal more. The stakes were high. A carefully controlled trial, with an amenable judge, a dilatory prosecutor, and a powerful defence barrister would ensure, as far as it is possible to do in such a matter, that the accused was acquitted. It is surely the case of Marguerite Alibert which Travers Humphreys alludes to in this account, and his doing so is all the more remarkable, because although he does not mention this, the public prosecutor who so inadequately presented the police case on that occasion too was Sir Percival Clarke. Both trials, heard before a free jury, succeeded in producing verdicts of not guilty against all odds, in the face of common sense, and in spite of considerable evidence. Of all the evidence available to him, and from which the meanest barrister could have constructed a formidable case, Sir Percival Clarke made a wholly inadequate one for the Crown. That he did so was not simply remiss. It was calculated. It was deliberate. It is not possible to say that the public prosecutor deliberately threw a prosecution case in the manner of a rigged third-rate boxing match. That would be too great a charge to make against essentially decent men, men of integrity whose lives were spent in seeking to uphold and apply the law. But there can be little doubt that in the case of Elvira Barney, the public prosecutor had made a conscious decision to exercise restraint in the pursuit of justice, and that being plainly understood, it was played out to perfection within the constraints placed upon it by the judicial system. Sir Percival Clarke understood in direct terms that this was not a case the prosecution wished to pursue with the greatest vigour, but he understood also, as a matter of social class, as a matter of the preservation of the society to which he belonged, that a well-connected young woman like Elvira Barney must not be hanged. He understood it as Detective Sergeant Campion understood it when Elvira Barney called him a vile swine, and struck him, struck him as she would one of her father's 20-something servants at 6 Belgrave Square, because police were servants in those days, not only servants to society, but to those who ran it, in fact especially so. And what did Sergeant Campion do when assaulted by Barney? Nothing. Later he says she apologized and said she was very, very sorry. Of course Elvira Barney said nothing of the kind. A woman like Elvira Barney does not apologize to servants. It is not in her social DNA to do so. Campion hears his dog call. It amounts to an apology on his part. On hearing of her acquittal in court, Inspector Winter rushes over to congratulate Lady Mullins. She waves him aside dismissively. It is this subservient conduct, the manifestation and assertion of class division, which is fascinating in this case, and critical to its outcome. It is the purpose of a court of law to weigh those scales of justice, not to produce a result that is certain. Certainty is not the business of any form of human knowledge, and the proof demanded by law is one which is beyond reasonable doubt to the ordinary intelligent man or woman. It seeks therefore an overwhelming probability in a matter which is sufficient to satisfy the normal intelligent person. In the case of Elvira Barney, that probability was surely satisfied in the evidence acquired, though not in its presentation to the court, because when the scales of justice were employed to weigh that evidence, a few counterbalancers had been added to ensure the scales produced the desired effect, and as a result, in July 1932, Elvira Barney got away with murder. Elvira Barney was a woman of great arrogance, and she was overindulged by those who loved her. She was certainly mentally unstable, and she sought out relationships which were mutually abusive. The quarrels, the violence, seemed to have a sexually compulsive charge to them. The risk, the danger, living on the precipice, was exciting. She thrived on the existential thrill of excess. But the quest for another high is self-limiting, because yesterday's excess becomes today's norm, and it is ever necessary to extend the boundaries of excess to satisfy tomorrow's higher expectations. The relationship with Michael Stephen was going nowhere. From sexual frisson, it had pursued its compulsive course of control, demand, and insatiable excess. The quarrels and violence could only increase to take up the slack. Elvira's relationships usually ended when her lover could stand no more. They walked out on her. They left. She dared them to it. Charles Graves had done so, and she had pursued him with a revolver. To others she had called the police to have them removed. Michael Stephen seemed extraordinarily resilient. He endured their cycle of fight and make up. Perhaps that was a measure of his own compulsion, or perhaps of necessity, because she held the purse strings. He was dependent on her. When they rowed on the 19th of May in the early hours, he came back twice. Then she shot at him, but he apparently still returned beneath her window to tell her not to make a spectacle of herself. He didn't take her threats with the gun seriously. Had he done so, he'd have removed it, thrown it away, or unloaded it. He didn't fear her shooting him. He regarded it as a gesture. He slept in a grocer's van that night, though, and in the morning they made up. Their passion was requited, again traversing the wide spectrum from hate to love in just a few hours. The row in the early hours of the 31st of May 1932 would probably have played out this way too. But shooting a revolver as an expression of personal frustration, as part of a wild game of increasing stakes, is dangerous. Michael Stephen was wise enough to realize her intention in the matter was harmless, but too young to know that her control of the matter was not. His mockery of her, his disbelief that the act of shooting at him, of threatening him, was serious, only hastened the moment at which her judgment would be overtaken by her emotions, with catastrophic result. When they rowed on the 31st of May 1932, A row which had been simmering all day, which focused on another woman, a gambit preferred by both, apparently, in this game of rising stakes. Elvira seized the gun. She told him to get out. She hated him. He said he would. He would go to his other woman. He dressed. This did not requite the passion of her fury. It was her move. "I will shoot you," she threatened. He ignored her, possibly smiled, but would certainly have shown his disregard for her threat. That was his habit. It was his riposte. She went to him, and he turned to her. She fired the gun. It was a perfectly natural consequence of the dialogue running between them. But his surprise was palpable. "Good God, what have you done?" These were probably his last words. The bullet, narrowly missing his heart, caused him to cough as his lungs filled with blood, and he collapsed very quickly and died within minutes. Of course, Elvira was distraught, remorseful, horrified, and yet here was another extreme emotion savoured. It was a game they had played many times, and this was the perfect game, with the most tragic of outcomes. It could never be played again. After her release from the court, a woman acquitted of the worst of crimes, her conduct was such that Justice Travers Humphreys remarked, "Most extraordinary. Apparently we should have given her a pat on the back." But people like to see justice served, and in a Britain where the differences between the social classes were being slowly but surely eroded, where a Labour Party had eclipsed the Liberal Party as the voice of the mainstream left, and where women had achieved universal suffrage only 4 years previously, there was a demand for equality before the law also. It seemed to many that the invisible yet indelible social contract upon which the lord and servant were treated with equal regard before the law had not been observed that day. Elvira Barney returned to her parents' house in Belgrave Square after the trial. It was remarked that she looked much older than her 27 years. She had a distinctly middle-aged appearance for one so young. The following day, a beaming Elvira Barney was out in her car, a blue Delage, which had been fetched by a chauffeur from 21 William Mews on the previous afternoon, valeted and washed and wax-polished. There was a stream of bouquets of flowers delivered to 6 Belgrave Square throughout the day, and it was reported that she received hundreds of letters and many telegrams congratulating her. She drove off to visit her friends and reportedly to visit her hairdresser. 5 weeks in prison can wreak havoc with your hair. In fact, it was reported that during the trial for her life she had been occupied making such appointments, so certain was she of her acquittal. In any case, whether that was true or not, within a short time she had returned to her old haunts, and to drinking and drugs. She visited the Café de Paris for the first time since that night when she had shot her lover dead, and according to the press, who followed her and her every indiscretion, she called from the dance floor there, "I am the woman who shot her lover. Take a good look at me." It was hardly calculated to endear her to the press and the public to whom it was eagerly reported, nor to the authorities who had done all in their power to contrive an acquittal for her. And if it did not prove her guilt, being something in the nature of a taunt, a fatuous witticism rather than a confession, then it hardly showed remorse or regret for taking the life of her young lover, whether by accident or design. It is likely, of course, that her exuberant indiscretion owed something to alcohol and cocaine. But this was 1932. Bright young things were no longer regarded as bright, and were not particularly young any more either. The hedonism of the post-war 20s, conceived of as a reaction to a war which had visited such horror upon a generation, had given way to a more sober 30s, a rapprochement of old values recouched in new fashions. Elvira Barney found herself unfashionable, a byword for excess, mildly shunned, a somewhat unstable woman, whispered about wherever she went, unsuitable company except for those who sought the fleeting and undiscriminating attention that notoriety brings. She moved to France within weeks of the trial, where her alcohol-fueled, drug-dependent and sexually driven lifestyle continued remorselessly. In the end, she was fined a mere £50 for the illegal possession of the gun which killed Michael Stephen. She had a much-publicised car accident in Cannes, in which a Countess Caroli was severely injured, for which Elvira was arrested, and which cost her, or her parents, £800 in damages when it was settled. She was somewhat estranged from her parents. The suicide of a woman called Gertrude Gamble in a Mayfair street some weeks after the trial, who had sent Lady Mullins a letter concerning Elvira's lesbian indulgences, may have been the last straw. Elvira continued as she had, with greater intensity. But there was a certain self-destructive impulse to her behaviour now. The joy of living a life of excess seemed to have become a compulsive and tawdry one, made arduous by its very predictability. And whatever her indulgence, it was blunted by the terrible, inescapable memory of a man she undoubtedly loved, choking to death on his own blood, as she knelt beside him, promising him the world. Just 4 years after her trial for murder, in the early hours of the 25th of December 1936, Elvira Barney returned from a party to her hotel off the Champs-Élysées. She had drunk far too much and snorted copious quantities of cocaine, and had to be assisted by the hall porter to her room, where she collapsed on her bed. Here, later that Christmas Day, she was found dead, when her door was forced by hotel staff. She was lying half on the bed and half off, wearing her jewels and furs and all her finery. She had died of some form of hemorrhage during the night, possibly as a result of taking a cocktail of alcohol and drugs the previous evening. Her father and mother went over to Paris the following day to see their errant daughter for the last time. Elvira Barney was cremated in Paris on the 29th of December 1936. She was 32 years old.